The prairie stretched before him like a faded memory, gold and wind-whipped, the horizon melting into a burnt orange sky. His horse's hooves raised small clouds of dust, each grain catching the last rays of sunlight, a shimmer that made him squint. He hadn't been home in years, and yet the land felt impossibly familiar. The crooked fence posts, the hollowed-out tree by the creek, the scent of wild sage carried on the wind. Every step closer tightened something in his chest, a mix of longing and apprehension, as if the very earth remembered him and was waiting for him to speak. He guided his mount along the worn trail, noticing how the homestead had changed, yet somehow remained stubbornly the same. Smoke rose from the chimney in lazy spirals, curling toward the darkening sky, and he realized the scent of burning would carry more than warmth. It carried life. The porch boards creaked under his boots as he approached, uneven and weathered, each crack whispering of years he had missed. There was movement inside, subtle, human. Through the open door, he saw them. His parents, older, their hair streaked with silver, hands marked by toil and sun, huddled close near the fire. Between them knelt a woman, tending the flames with deliberate care, her back straight, shoulders steady. She moved as though the hearth were a small sanctuary she protected against the world, and he found himself studying the curve of her neck, the way her hands flexed over the logs. Something in that scene knotted his chest, a quiet, domestic authority that he had never seen in their home before. He had imagined returning to familiar warmth, not this intrusion of calm efficiency that felt foreign and somehow right. His mother glanced up, and recognition flickered in her eyes, a careful warmth tempered by hesitation. His father's expression was less readable, stoic lines carved deeper by the years of absence. The man's eyes held questions unspoken, some of them sharp enough to pierce the thin veil of the evening light. He swallowed against the knot of guilt, knowing that every moment of delay, every reckless choice that had driven him away, had been counted and catalogued. The woman, widowed, no doubt, though he did not know her story, moved with quiet authority, arranging logs with precision born of necessity. She offered him a nod, a recognition of the world he had returned to, without words, but her presence was commanding, almost territorial. The small intimacy she shared with his parents, a warmth that was both protective and tender, stirred something unfamiliar in him, something he had not expected. Envy tinged with respect, admiration edged with sharp sting of intrusion. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and he felt it as sharply as if it had touched his skin. Outside, clouds roiled, their gray shadows crawling across the prairie like restless ghosts. He remembered storms from his childhood, sudden and violent, leaving tracks in mud and heartbreak alike. This one seemed different, heavier somehow, carrying with it a sense of unfinished business. He adjusted the saddle strap, feeling its familiar leather under his fingers, the weight of his revolver a dull comfort at his hip. His father cleared his throat, a gravelly sound that carried both warning and welcome. "You're late," he said. The word stripped the ceremony, but the inflection told of patience worn thin over years. His mother's hands lingered near the fire, as though the warmth she tended might shield them all from what was coming. The woman spoke softly then, her voice steady, careful, threading through the room like smoke curling toward the ceiling. "Sit," she said, simple, almost commanding. It was an invitation not to friendship, but to coexistence in the moment, a fragile truce that would have a hold until the world outside could be reckoned with. He moved toward the hearth, letting the firelight illuminate the lines of his own face. Time had weathered him too, scarred his hands, pulled his shoulders into a slightly hunched stance, etched fatigue beneath his eyes. Yet there was something in him that remembered courage, something stubborn that refused to bow entirely to regret. As he knelt, the warmth of the fire seeped through his coat, the glow revealing not just his own reflection, but the mirror of life that continued in his absence. The woman's eyes met his briefly, and in that glance he understood a truth he had not anticipated. The world had moved forward without him, and yet it had not forgotten him. His parents' hands found one another, a small anchor in the middle of shifting circumstances. He felt the tension in his chest ease, just slightly, as he realized that the home he had fled still held him, even if its contours had changed. Outside, the first rumbles of the approaching storm rolled over the hills. Lightning fractured the sky, casting the house in stark silhouettes. The wind rose, carried with the scent of rain and earth and the unspoken promise that the past, long deferred, would soon be confronted. And as he settled beside the hearth, he knew the return was not simply a homecoming. It was an awakening. The quiet peace of the evening, the subtle authority of the woman, the patient scrutiny of his parents. All were warnings, invitations, and challenges folded into one. The fire crackled. Shadows danced along the walls. And he finally allowed himself to breathe. The storm would come, and with it the reckoning. But for now, he was home, not as a visitor, not as an intruder, but as a man returned, uncertain and raw, yet ready to face what had been left behind. The wind had shifted by dawn, bringing with it a sharp bite that cut through the quiet warmth of the hearth. He rose early, hands stiff, muscles tight from the long ride, and stepped onto the porch. The prairie lay damp, glistening with the first silver of rain-soaked grass. He inhaled, the scent of wet earth mingling with smoke, and for a moment he allowed himself to remember the boy who had once sprinted barefoot across these fields, chasing the horizon with reckless certainty. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man tempered by absence, each scar a punctuation of mistakes he could no longer ignore. Inside, the fire had dwindled to embers. His parents moved about the kitchen with habitual care, her fingers brushing over the ruffle of the table, his father sharpening a knife with deliberate strokes. The widow stirred porridge, the steam rising like smoke from a distant battlefield, carrying the faint metallic tang of early morning. He watched her, noticing how she adjusted the flame under the pot, her movements economical but precise, as though she had been preparing for storms both literal and unseen for longer than she could name. There was a rhythm to her presence that unsettled him. She had made this place her own, woven herself into the threads of a life he had thought belonged solely to his family. His mother finally spoke, voice low and measured. "You should sit. Eat before the day drags you into the mud again." Her words carried the softness of concern, but were tempered by caution. She had watched him leave once, years ago, and the memory lingered like an unhealed wound. His father said nothing at first, his gaze steady, weighing him, as if counting the ways he might have failed before he had even opened his mouth. There was trust in that silence, yes, but also expectation, and the knowledge that every decision, every misstep, would be noted and remembered. They ate quietly, the clatter of spoons against the bowls filling the room, punctuated by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the sigh of the wind outside. He asked about the crops, the livestock, the fences, the things that had once been mundane but now carried the weight of survival. Each answer revealed more than progress. They revealed endurance. The woman added details with a confidence that unsettled him, her voice threading knowledge and authority into the conversation without claiming it as her own. He noticed the subtle glances exchanged between her and his parents, a silent language he had never learned, and felt both an outsider and a witness, keenly aware of the life that had carried on in his absence. After the meal, he stepped outside again, drawn to the distant hills where dark clouds coalesced, a gathering storm that mirrored the tension he could feel in his own chest. Memories surfaced, unbidden and vivid. He saw himself years ago, fists raised in anger at a man who had insulted his family's name, guns drawn before words could settle between them. The fight had ended with blood and broken pride, and the town's whispers had pushed him further from home than any horse could carry him. He clenched his hands, nails digging into palms, remembering the choices that led to years of solitude and the quiet gnawing of regret. The woman stepped out behind him, her boots sinking into wet grass. She did not speak immediately, letting the wind carry their shared silence. When she finally did, her voice was calm but firm. "You left a long time ago. You came back, but the land, the people, they don't stop while you wander." There was no accusation, only truth delivered with the precision of one accustomed to survival. He nodded, the words striking with the weight of recognition. She had seen what he had not. The resilience required to endure, the quiet courage of those who remain. His parents joined them at the edge of the porch, and for a moment they all stared at the horizon. The storm drew closer, a wall of gray that rolled and heaved with latent power, lightning flickering like fractured promises across its bulk. He realized, with a pulse of both dread and clarity, that the storm would demand more than shelter. It would demand reckoning, past grievances, unspoken resentments, the debts of absence. all of it would surface when the wind howled and the rain struck the earth with relentless insistence. He could feel the tension in his father's stance, the quiet vigilance in his mother's eyes, the subtle readiness in the woman who had so seamlessly taken her place beside them. He spoke then, carefully, each word measured. "I didn't come back to watch the world move without me. I came back to be here, to help, to make it right." The words were not grand, but they carried the weight of admission, the acknowledgement of the long silence between who he had been and who he hoped to become. His father's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. His mother's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, tentative but real, and the woman gave a small tilt of her head, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that she would not allow him to stumble unchallenged, but neither would she reject him entirely. The first drops of rain struck the porch roof with soft, insistent taps, a prelude to storm that would soon descend. The prairie shivered under the growing wind, and in that moment he understood that the past was not merely a series of shadows he had left behind. It was alive, pressing toward them with all the force of consequence. He returned inside, closing the door against the wind, feeling the warmth of the hearth and the watchful presence of those who had endured while he was gone. He did not know what the storm would bring, only that it would arrive, and that when it did, no one could hide from its reckoning. And in the quiet before the deluge, as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the walls, he felt the fragile stirrings of something he had not felt in years: hope. The storm struck with a sudden ferocity, as if the sky itself had remembered the years he had been gone and sought to punish them all. Rain hammered the roof in relentless sheets, each drop a sharp percussion that rattled the windows and splintered the calm he had just begun to taste. The wind tore through the prairie, bending the grass into submission, carrying the scent of wet earth, ozone, and distant fire. He stood at the doorway, coat plastered his back, eyes scanning the horizon as lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the landscape in ghostly bursts. Inside, his parents moved with quiet urgency, hands gripping chairs and bracing against the tremor of thunder. The woman tended the fire with the same meticulous care as before, but her eyes flicked to the doorway now and then, sharp and calculating, scanning for threats beyond the storm's fury. Her presence had always unsettled him, but now it gave him clarity. She was not merely a visitor. She was a force, a guardian shaped by necessity and tempered by hardship. He realized, with a twinge of awe and unease, that he would need her as much as he would need his parents if the coming hours demanded courage. A sudden crack of thunder shook the homestead, and the windows rattled violently. He glanced toward the fields, and through the downpour he saw movement, a figure emerging from a gray haze, boots sinking into the mud, a rifle cradled in one arm. His pulse spiked. Instinct honed by years of wandering snapped into place. The past had not forgotten him, and had arrived under the cover of the storm. His father reached for the rifle above the mantel, knuckles whitening, while his mother motioned for them to stay low. The woman stepped forward, voice steady but commanding. "They know you're here. They'll try to take advantage." Her gaze met his, unwavering, and he understood that she had already calculated the odds, already mapped the moves he had yet to consider. Together, they formed a silent strategy, a rhythm born of necessity rather than words. The figure drew closer, and the rain spat against the windows like bullets. He could hear the distant echo of hooves in the mud, the creak of leather, the faint metallic ring of spurs. Memories of past conflicts, barroom brawls, reckless duels, nights when gunpowder and anger had ruled his choices, flared, sharpened by adrenaline. He gripped his own rifle, its familiar way to comfort, and positioned himself near the doorway, ready for the confrontation he had both feared and expected. The first shots rang out, splintering the silence of the storm. Thunder roared in tandem, masking the crack of gunfire, and the world outside became a blur of gray, mud, and motion. He fired, controlled, deliberate, each shot a punctuation of intent, not fury. The woman moved with fluid precision, taking cover, returning fire when necessary, her presence beside him a revelation of strength he had not anticipated. His parents stayed low, fear tempered by the knowledge that he and this woman could protect them. But every instinct screamed that the danger would not be so easily repelled. The rain turned to a relentless downpour, washing away footprints and erasing the landscape in a murky haze. He felt the storm outside seep into the house, into every creaking beam and shutter, until the homestead itself seemed to pulse with tension. One figure slipped inside, boots sliding on the slick floorboards, and he met them head-on, fists and rifle colliding in a kinetic blur of struggle, with splintered, sweat and rain mixed with blood as he fought with every ounce of skill honed by years of survival. The woman was there, blocking, striking, moving with an instinctive precision that forced him to recognize not only her courage but her necessity. Amid the chaos, he caught sight of his parents, huddled but unharmed, their eyes wide, trusting, a silent reminder what he was fighting for. The storm's fury outside mirrored the chaos within, each flash of lightning illuminating a world in which life and death coexisted in stark, unforgiving clarity. He realized that the past was not merely a memory. It was alive, clawing, demanding acknowledgement, and he had no choice but to meet it head-on. After what felt like hours compressed into moments, the intruders faltered, pushed back by a combination of skill, determination, and the unspoken unity of those who had survived together, even briefly. The house shook with the storm's final rage, the fire sputtering under the onslaught of wind and water, but the immediate danger receded. He lowered his rifle, hands trembling, soaked to the bone, heart hammering with exertion and relief. The woman stood beside him, her breath steady, eyes sharp, a small acknowledgement of mutual respect passing between them. The storm began to abate, the rain easing to a steady drizzle, and the prairie exhaled, releasing the tension it had held. He glanced at his parents, saw the relief etched into their faces, and felt the first true understanding of his return settle in. They had endured without him, yes, but their endurance had not diminished the need for him now. Not in the fight, not in the reckoning, not in the quiet moments after chaos. He stepped to the window, watching the first glimmers of light break through the heavy clouds. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence he had carried inside. Yet as he exhaled, he felt the weight of years lift slightly. The battle had ended, for now, but the reckoning, the confrontation with what had been left unresolved, remained. He knew the dawn would bring more than sunlight. It would bring clarity, questions, and the necessity of facing truths long buried. Inside, the fire sputtered back to life, casting warm, flickering light over soaked faces and tense muscles. Silence, tentative and fragile, settled over the room, punctuated only by the occasional drip of water from the eaves. He allowed himself a moment, brief and private, to acknowledge the thrill, fear, and relief coursing through him. He had survived the storm, both outside and within, but the horizon still held shadows he could not yet name. And as he sank into the heart's warmth, hands still trembling, he knew the night was far from over. The storm had passed, but its echo remained, and with it, the certainty that the past would demand its reckoning at dawn. The dawn arrived pale and hesitant, sunlight struggling through the dissipating storm clouds, turning the prairie into a wet, glimmering expanse. He stepped outside, boots sinking into softened earth, and scanned the horizon. The intruders had retreated into the gray distance, but he knew better than to trust absence over vigilance. Every ripple in the grass, every distant shadow, could carry threat. The storm had passed, but the reckoning it carried had only begun. Inside, his parents moved with measured calm, restoring the small routines disrupted by the night's chaos. The widow tended the fire once more, but her eyes never rested. They swept the doorway, the windows, the tree-line beyond. She had proven herself indispensable, a guardian whose presence forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth. He could no longer shoulder the past alone. For the first time, he recognized in her a partner, not in sentimentality, but in survival, in the raw business of protecting life and honor. A sudden snap of a branch outside pulled his attention. He spun, rifle in hand, muscles coiled like spring steel. Two figures emerged in the mist, silhouettes dark against the glimmering prairie, their intent clear in every calculated step. The intruders from last night, emboldened, reckless in the aftermath of their storm-tossed retreat, were back. His pulse surged, but it was steadier now, tempered by experience, by the lessons learned the hours before. The woman stepped beside him, her hand brushing his as she moved. He felt her grip, firm and unwavering, and it anchored him. They had no words for this alliance. None were necessary. In the silence, strategies passed between them, quick as the wind. He nodded, and they moved as one toward the threshold, eyes sharp, senses heightened, every heartbeat a drum of anticipation. The first shot shattered the morning calm, gunfire echoing off distant hills, and the remains of the storm. Rain still fell in hesitant drizzles, mixing with mud and sweat and the faint metallic tang of fear. He fired, measured, tracking the advancing shadows. The woman ducked and rolled, emerging behind cover, rifle ready, her presence a constant, unspoken reassurance. His parents stayed low, hands gripping each other, eyes wide but steady, witnesses to the courage that had returned home with him. A figure lunged toward the doorway, and he met them with a swing of the rifle, but the impact sending the assailant sprawling. Another shot rang out, and the woman pivoted, covering his flank with deadly precision. The battle was violent, intimate, raw. Each movement mattered. Each misstep could mean ruin. He realized in that moment that the storm had forged something new in them all, a rhythm of cooperation, a recognition that survival required unity and trust, not just skill or bravado. Amid the chaos, his thoughts flickered to the years he had lost, the silences he had lived with, the guilt that shadowed him. Now, standing in the maelstrom of violence and wind, he understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the deliberate choice to face it, alongside those who mattered most. The woman's steady hands, the silent fortitude of his parents, their shared glance that spoke of enduring love and patience. It all converged into a clarity that had been absent for too long. One last figure pressed forward, desperate, reckless. He met them with controlled force, disarming, pushing, forcing submission. The fight ended as abruptly as it had begun, the final echo of gunfire swallowed by the still dripping prairie. The intruders lay defeated, their threat extinguished not by luck, but by a convergence of courage, skill, and unspoken bonds forged in crisis. Silence returned, heavy and deliberate, broken only by the drip of rain and the occasional crackle of recovering fire. He lowered his rifle, feeling muscles tense for the first time in hours relax. The woman stood near him, chest rising steadily, eyes meeting his with a look that conveyed acknowledgement, respect, and a quiet relief. He offered a small nod, tentative but sincere. They had fought together, survived together, and in that, something unspoken had shifted. Inside, his parents emerged, shoulders eased but eyes still watchful, hands clasped together as though reaffirming the tenuous security of their lives. His father's voice, gravelly and taut with emotion, broke the silence. You came back, and you stayed when it counted. It was praise of the simplest, most profound kind, and it struck him harder than any applause ever could. His mother's hand brushed his cheek, briefly, an intimate acknowledgement of forgiveness and enduring love. The woman returned to her duties, but he noticed the small gestures, a pause to glance at him, a fleeting smile, the way she adjusted the fire with quiet precision, as if claiming her place without words. He understood then that home was no longer a place he had left behind. It was a convergence of lives, of choices, of courage tested and proven. He had returned not merely to a house, but to the people who had endured, and in enduring, had carved a space for him once more. The storm finally released its last hold, sunlight breaking fully through the clouds, glinting on wet grass, puddles reflecting the sky like broken mirrors. He stepped outside, inhaling the clean, earthy air, feeling the pulse of the prairie beneath his boots. He looked at his parents, at the woman, at the home that had weathered both the storm and his absence. The past had demanded its reckoning, and they had met it together. He mounted his horse briefly, letting the wind carry his coat and hair, tasting the freedom of movement and the calm of survival. Then he turned back to the hearth, to the warmth of the fire, to the faces of those he had fought to protect. The horizon stretched endless and golden, but for the first time it no longer seemed a threat. It was an invitation. The world remained rugged and uncertain, but in that quiet, soaked dawn he felt an anchoring truth. They had endured. They had faced a storm, both literal and metaphorical, and emerged bound not just by blood, but by trust, courage, and the unspoken promise that whatever came next, they would meet it together.